No one ever will if I don't say something. If I just lie still, would I be a monster? Scare them all away if I let them hear.
This song is from the 2017 Women's March on Washington, D.C. It's sung by Connie Lim alongside the protesters attending the march, about fear to speak out for what is right, and against inequality due to the fear of judgment. Unfortunately, this is no new issue.
Equality is one of the ideas that America has seen a lot of struggle with since its conception. The first seeds of inequality began to grow as colonizers reached the Americas for the first time in the early 1500s and committed genocide against native peoples. And these poison plants grew more when the first slaves were brought here in 1619.
It's exacerbated by economic troubles, pitting the poor against the rich, and by homophobia and transphobia, treating people who experience gender attraction differently from others as less than. But one of the oldest forms of inequality, something that entire civilizations have been built off the backs of for millennia, is sexism.
While all of these issues and many more are very important and we believe must be challenged systemically, sexism and misogyny are harder to spot in today's society and our everyday lives, and will continue to be issues without more education on the subject than that there is today.
As seen in the Declaration of Independence itself, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
However, these truths and rights are not just for men.
In 1848, in the Seneca Falls Convention, abolitionists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott declared instead that all men and women are created equal.
History.com explains that this was one of the defining moments in the women's rights movement. The feminism movement began to take off in America at this moment in 1848. With such inspiring leaders, awareness of misogyny grew as misconceptions and the true meaning of feminism both rose to the surface, and modern feminists began to state that all people should be created equal and treated equal regardless of gender. But we're not quite there yet. I'm Lily Wall.
And I'm Evie Schmidt.
And we ask you to join us today as we seek to create discourse on the topic of feminism through 3 separate but critically intertwined sections: meanings, misconceptions, and misogyny. Welcome to Feminism 101.
Part 1. Meanings.
Something that makes the feminist movement largely inaccessible is the large amounts of jargon and specific words that get thrown around a lot that most people don't know what they actually mean. If you type feminism into Google, you get this: the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes.
But what does that mean?
But what does that mean?
I don't know. What does that mean?
We talked to 3 women who identify as feminists to get their perspectives on what feminism is and what it means to them.
Kate, do you identify as a feminist?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people are afraid of the word feminist. I've never really understood why there's this fear of using the word feminist. I absolutely would call myself a feminist, and I would call myself an intersectional feminist. And essentially what that means to me in its broadest definition is a belief that women should have fundamentally equal opportunities, and have equal opportunities both socially, politically, and economically, and equal opportunities to exist in the world.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important because there are so many people that don't know what being a feminist actually means. They, have ideas maybe of what they see in the media or what they see people, talking about or making jokes about, and that's very different from what feminism actually is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Next, we talk to Abby, who is involved in academia surrounding women's studies.
So I would definitely say I call myself a feminist. To me, that means just I guess the, social and economic equality of, the sexes is the traditional definition of it. But I guess it just means fighting for equality for everyone. I know it's hard to put into words, especially because like I kind of like study it, so it's like there's just like so much that goes into it. But I feel like a big thing that I think of in feminism is like the personal is the political. So like your personal experiences are political. So I think that's a big part of it for me. Like the things that I've gone through and the things that other people go through, those are political, and like those are things that we need to be like listening to, and like listening to people in like marginalized groups and marginalized identities.
Something you might have heard thrown around in there is misogyny. But what is misogyny?
Misogyny is defined simply as bias against women. This bias can come from anyone, anywhere, even the most feminist of people. More on that later. In an article by the New York Times, the origin of misogyny was explored. It's explained that the misogyny itself, that term, emerged in the 1800s when an anti-women pamphlet was released by a man named Joseph Swetnam.
This pamphlet talked about women as painted ships because they looked pretty but contained only lead. Other crude insults were used, all of which were offensive to women. In response to this pamphlet, an anonymously written feminist play was made, called Swetnam, the woman hater arraigned by women.
In this play, the woman hater was named misogynist, as per the Greek roots of the words. This term was used to identify Swetnam's discriminatory behavior against women, and continues to be used today to describe aversion to and prejudice against women.
That prejudice isn't always as blatant as that, though, but we'll get into examples of misogyny later.
Another one of these terms that you've probably heard before is patriarchy.
What is patriarchy? Patriarchy, by definition, as per Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is a system of society or government in which the father or eldest male is the head of the family and descent is tracked through the male line.
It is what feminism aims to fight, as equality between genders is more important than male superiority, within the feminist viewpoint at least. Patriarchy in our world is the male-dominated global order that exists and we can see. You can see it in the number of male leaders that we have on the global level, leading countries, or people leading companies, or schools, or anything like that.
It's easy to write that off within modern context. In the United States, women can go to school and work and could theoretically hold any position that they wanted to in the workplace. Even though that may not specifically be the case, even if it were, The Guardian explains that, but for those who have lost a basic trust in the forward motion of human progress, or who were born too recently to have known it, patriarchy seems exactly the word to explain the continued existence of pervasive, seemingly ineradicable inequality. Here's what Kate had to say about patriarchy.
So patriarchy is not like some old white guy that's just like, women must be this. Patriarchy is systemically ingrained in the way that our systems exist. So like the systems that women exist in were not built by women and were not built for women. They were built for men. So I think that it's like in terms of like a real world example, I've had opposing counsel, like I'm an attorney, right? I go to court. I've had opposing counsel call me sweetheart, like in the courtroom. Well, I just turned around and I was just like, okay, honey bunch, whatever you say. And he kind of did a double take. So I think that, I think also, I see pretty frequently, like if a woman is, a forceful woman, she is portrayed as being like hormonal or irrational or masculine or whatever. And we have this very, very defined idea of what femininity is and what femininity should be. And those are not necessarily like values and roles that women made for themselves.
Patriarchy is, in short, the normalization of a misogynistic world order.
A word you might not have heard, however, is intersectionality. What is intersectionality?
Intersectionality is a way of broadening the lens of feminism, which largely focused on how not all women experience gender in the same way. One of the women we talked to, Abby, Kate, Karen, explained this to us.
Karen introduced herself to us as an intersectional feminist, and how that means something different to a lot of people from what intersectionality is.
I do call myself a feminist.
To me, it means that I am all for equality, no matter what, like, realm we're talking about, right? So when I tell people I'm a feminist, usually I will say I'm an intersectional feminist because that softens the blow of the F word, right? Because like if you're among kind company, then there's no problem, saying that word. But that word is loaded. It's loaded for some folks. So a lot of the times I'll preface it by saying I'm an intersectional feminist. And when they ask what that means, I'll say that it means that when I consider equality, we have to approach it from the standpoint of all of the different facets of identity that affect equality in the real world.
So intersectionality is really about understanding how the intersections of multiple different identities create a whole human. In my view, if my feminism is not for everyone, then it's just like a feminist cloak on white supremacy, and that's not okay.
Intersectionality is like an analytical tool to think about oppression and to think about how to fight against oppression and produce knowledge about oppression. So in academia, which is kind of what I'm in right now in school, we talk about it. Oh, at a timer. We talk about it in that. We have to make sure that we're looking through the lens of the most marginalized, and we're listening to the most marginalized people, and we're recognizing that there's intersecting experiences and intersecting oppression. So you're not just one thing. No one is ever just a woman. They're a white woman, they're a black woman, they're all these different things. They're a straight woman, they're a straight white woman, they're a queer white woman. So you're never just one thing. You have so many identities, even if you don't think of those identities as identities and things that are salient in your life. They are.
So to recap, intersectionality is basically the idea that we all experience the world differently and can't try to define all of those under one label, such as feminism. Next, I asked what these women thought that we can all do individually to make sure that our feminism is as inclusive as it can be.
How can people work to be more inclusive and intersectional with their feminism?
I guess it depends, on who you are, where you're at. I think, I've met people who call themselves feminists at all different levels, right? So, I've met child feminists, and what does it mean for them to be inclusive versus what does it mean for I'm an educator, right? So an intersectional educator, our role is a lot different. So I guess it means, for me, it means capitalizing on whatever your role is in society and using it to further equality.
Now that we have some basic feminist terminology down, let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Part 2, Misconceptions.
One of the most damaging things to the modern feminist movement is the sheer amount of misinformation there is surrounding the topic.
You probably know what we're talking about. The Facebook memes about how feminists are all bra-burning lesbians and the general idea that feminists hate men. Most of these ideas could be easily debunked, however. It just takes the analytical approach to them and the openness to multiple perspectives that is lost by much of modern society. Villanova University's Women's Studies Department has an article up on their website debunking many of these misconceptions.
They answer the Facebook memes perfectly when they say, being a feminist has nothing to do with sexual orientation or discrimination of the male gender. Feminists come from all different backgrounds and cultures to support equality and equity in general.
This ties back to that idea of intersectionality. Feminism is a means for approaching equality, but is entirely ineffective when tackled as simply a women versus men dichotomy. Because not only does that ignore people who don't fall on that gender binary, but it means that you're alienating half of the population either way.
This leads to one of the most infamous misconceptions about feminism, the idea that feminists hate men. This is simply not true.
Feminism seeks to eradicate gender stereotyping and gender roles, something that helps everyone. Villanova University again explains, men are taught in this society to be macho, emotionless leaders and to never show weakness. such as being sad and therefore crying as a result of that sadness. These socially constructed rules for men cause men to be socially confined.
Feminism says it's okay for men to show weakness, to be followers, and to show their emotions. Patriarchy hurts men too, and that's something that's crucial to understand.
Teresa Young encompasses this and more in an interview. She is the CEO and president of Ms. Foundation, a nonprofit foundation building women's collective power for social, economic, and reproductive justice.
In the interview, Teresa Young describes true feminism as true equality. True feminism is a recognition of the dynamics that each person brings to the table. And I say each person's because women will have reached truest levels of equality when men have also reached truest levels of equality. As long as we stay and assign task and duty, responsibility and opportunity to a particular gender, then we are not actually striving for true feminism.
During our video call with women who identify as feminists, Karen brought up the common thing that young women around the world have been saying: I hate men.
I do hear a lot of I hate men going on, right? I hear that. And I think that it's super problematic because it puts men at the front of the conversation that should not be about men in a world in which we're talking about equality of people who are divided with more than half females in the world, right? I think that's super problematic.
That's what we have on misconceptions, but now it's time to get into the root of the issue.
Part 3. Misogyny.
We talked a little bit about what misogyny is earlier. We now know that misogyny is defined as a bias against women, right? Well, it's not just men who hold these biases. There's something called internalized misogyny that affects women too.
Like the name suggests, internalized misogyny is a bias against women that women have too. This is often a result of the environment, seeing as we are all impacted by bias in the media, art, culture, politics, and people around us, and is just as damaging as external misogyny.
These aren't as apparently misogynistic as a man telling his wife to go make him a sandwich, but are still prevalent symptom of patriarchy.
To any women listening, how many times have you looked at another woman and thought that she must be any of a number of horrible things because her skirt is too short? While those things are bad things to be thinking and are misogynistic, I think we've all been there at some point in our lives. Maybe not with that specific example, but with something along those lines.
Well, we have all been guilty of judging people based on their appearances, and a lot of those ideas are rooted in misogyny.
I agree. I think that there's a lot of ideas we have about people that we can get and gather from their appearances that aren't necessarily true and are generally very misogynistic, right? Things you might think because, I don't know, maybe someone wears a lot of makeup and you might think that that might mean that they're not maybe as smart or that they value beauty over brains. But there's no inherent dichotomy there. There's no reason to think that you have to be smart or beautiful. Cool. We also talked about this with Karen, Kate, and Abby as well. Here's what they thought.
What's a time you've experienced or witnessed internalized misogyny?
I think a lot of that goes back to my experience in my youth, right, prior to debate, my belief, and then subsequent decision-making processes that I need to prioritize my future with a boy over my brain, which is just devastating. I think I lived through it.
I feel growing up and in high school, I always would compare myself to the other women around me. You don't really compare yourself to other men in the same way you compare yourself to other women because those are your competition. So I think that was a big thing that I had to struggle with. And going to college, I kind of had to try and unlearn why am I comparing myself to other women around me? Why do I think that, like, only one woman can be the best at something, or one woman can be the smartest, one woman can be, like, the prettiest, or anything like that. Like, we can all be pretty, we can all be smart, we can all be successful, so we don't have to fight each other to get there. That's a common thing that the patriarchy wants us to believe, so that we have to fight against each other instead of fighting against the patriarchy.
Oh my gosh. All the time. So like in myself, I definitely feel that imposter syndrome every now and then. And I think a lot of women do that. Like sometimes I'll be cognizant, like when I am, sitting next to like a guy on a bench, like making my body as small as possible, right? Because I realize like that's just because like I feel uncomfortable taking up space. Right. Mm-hmm. I definitely have experienced that myself. I think a really good example of internalized misogyny that I've seen outside of myself, though, is I remember speaking to family members who are just like, yeah, I just don't think a woman could be president. And I'm just like, well, tell me why. And they're just like, well, I just, men have always been president. And I'm just like, okay. But I think that like hearing things like that from women, or also when I hear women who are just like, oh, well, this woman was dressed this way and was therefore leading this guy on, that sort of thing. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of women, particularly older women, have experienced issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault and sexual violence and domestic violence, but those issues were culturally so silenced and normalized that it's really difficult to like look back retrospectively and be like, this thing that happened was not okay.
Yeah, I think these are things that we all see so frequently in our lives, but don't necessarily interpret as being like internalized misogyny. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's just so like powerful to know that those are things that we can like cognitively stop, within ourselves.
Absolutely.
What are some ways that you like personally worked to stop some internalized misogyny within like your own mind?
Ooh, that's good. I think that's hard. I think that a lot of it is just being aware of where some of those feelings are coming from. So like, for example, if I'm sitting on a train and I feel like I have to squish like this and a guy is sprawled out next to me, I just need to think to myself, like, why am I feeling the need to minimize myself right now? Like, why is that a feeling that I'm having? And then I think just like recognizing those instances is kind of a first step in deconstructing some of those things.
We hope that you've learned something today. We learned a lot in preparation for this podcast about feminism and its true meaning. We learned about the real-life issues that feminism aims to fight as well. Here's a few more that we didn't quite get to do whole segments on.
The pink tax, the overpricing of female products, remains prominent in today's society. A woman's deodorant costs more than men's, and female-marketed razors are priced more than men's razors.
Along with this issue, there's the wage gap. Women being paid less than men for no reason other than being female is very common in our society, despite how much we might think that wouldn't be the case. Unfortunately, this issue, along with harassment, are issues that are rarely thought of when one thinks of feminism. There's a lot more to feminism, and a lot more issues that need to be addressed, such as reproductive rights, lack of female representation in government, and school dress codes, that we hope you now have the tools to understand after listening to our podcast.
Feminism is needed to fight so many real, prevalent societal issues. As mentioned in an article for the Huffington Post by Brianna DeLeon, a student diplomat and feminist advocate, feminism is not a dirty word. We need feminism.
She goes on to explain that there are many people in the world that set a bad example of what feminism stands for. More must be done to highlight that these obstructions that women face are what feminism actually means to put a stop to, not thinly veiled misandry, which is the bias against men, cloaked under activism.
Thank you for tuning in today to listen to Feminism 101, and we hope that you learned as much as we have and maybe have a different understanding of the world and misogyny's impact on it through the lens of feminism.